So we could say, well, at one level of analysis, one level of resolution, it's pretty obvious that the world, the objective world, whatever that is made out of atoms. And Democritus said that a long time ago in Greece, right? He was the first guy that came up with the atomic theory. But he didn't say that the world was made out of atoms. He said that it was made out of atoms and space. And you think, well, that's, obvious. It's like, no, it's not that obvious. Because as soon as you have fundamental particles and space, you can array those particles in space. And you can array them in patterned ways. And the patterned ways are real too. The patterns are real too. So, and without the space, you can't do that. So atoms plus space gives rise to something else. And really what it gives rise to, as far as I can tell, is something very much like information. Now, information is a very complicated idea, what information is. But that's okay, we won't go into that at the moment. Think about music, right? Music is like atoms of sound, right? Because they're discrete quanta of sound, essentially. And they're arrayed out in patterns across time. And obviously the pattern, the music, is not just the note, it's the pattern across time. Okay, so one of the things we might say is that, well, there's atoms and there's space and there's patterns. Okay, so patterns. Now, what are the most fundamental patterns? Okay, so let's put it this way. We're going to say, well, what's your problem? How to live in the world. What's the world? Well, roughly speaking, the problem is how to live as an individual in society and nature. It's something like that. Okay, so then we're going to say, okay, if that's the actual problem, the first thing you have to do to solve that is to conceptualize society and nature and conceptualize the individual. So you have to represent them somehow. Okay, so how should you represent society and nature and the individual? And the answer to that is, that's complicated. It's not obvious. Now, we kind of know, for example, that one way of representing society is the dominance hierarchy. That's not only a way of representing it, it's a way of being in this society, right? To talk about the dominance hierarchy is to represent it. To be in a dominance hierarchy is to live it. So, we can think about a dominance hierarchy. Society is more than a dominance hierarchy, but that's not a bad first approximation. And then we can think of the place in which those dominance hierarchies exist. We might think, well, that's, for lack of a better way of conceptualizing, it's nature. So it's complicated because you can't actually sum these concepts up in single words. As far as I can tell, you have to use an array of words and an array of images because the categories are so broad that you just can't sum them up in a single concept. Okay, so you can sum them up with words, and you can sum them up with images, and you can sum them up with stories, and that's what we do as people. So the question, so we're going to say, well, is that the fundamental question? How to live as an individual in society and nature? It's like, well, I don't know if it's the fundamental question, but it's a fundamental question, so fine, we'll go with that. It's a story about this god called Tiamat, or Marduk. So here's the basic structure of the story. You got two primordial gods. Now, the way the Mesopotamians conceptualized the world is they kind of thought about it, you know how if you're out on a field, it's flat, and you kind of look at the world. The world looks like a dome, right, that's the sky, on a disk. So that's the Mesopotamian world. That's kind of the world as conceptualized by the people who wrote Genesis as well. It's a dome on a disk. Okay, so the disk is land, and underneath the land is water, fresh water. Why? Well, if you dig down in the land, you hit fresh water, and then underneath that is salt water, and how do you know that? Well, if you go out to the edges of the land and you find an ocean, it's salt water, so that's the hypothesis, okay? So, now, as far as the Mesopotamians were concerned, the salt water and the fresh water were two gods. Now, what did they represent? Well, one of them was male, and one of them was female, and the female one was the salt water, the male one was the fresh water. Okay, so now, and they kind of conceptualized that as a kind of a formless chaos. So you can kind of think of that water mixture as the chaos from which life emerged. It's something like that. But it's also the case, and we should remember, that life did emerge from water, and that without water you don't live. So it's not a stupid idea. It's kind of a low resolution idea. So is this chaotic intermingling of salt and fresh water. So that's sort of the idea. There's a chaos idea lurking at the bottom of that. And so that's Apsu and Tiamat. Now the Mesopotamians don't say much about Apsu. And I kind of think that, maybe that's because at that point society hadn't become so highly structured that, and long lasting, that a great representation of it had been formed. I don't think that happened until the Egyptians, but I might be wrong about that. But in any case, the Mesopotamians don't say much about Apsu. So what happens is, Tiamat's down there in the depths, sort of like the whale in Pinocchio. In fact, very much like the whale in Pinocchio. And Apsu's her husband, and they're locked together in a sexual embrace. And so part of the idea here is that, well, the union of opposites is necessary before something new can arise, and that union of opposites can be conceptualized in some way sexually, you know, using male and female, because when male and female come together, something new emerges out of that. And that's sort of ideas like the matrix, you know, the matrix of things, that's the mother, things emerge out of a matrix. So anyways, Apsu and Tiamat are down there in the depths, and they're locked together in a sexual embrace, and they produce offspring, and lots of them. So that's the initial world of the gods. Now, there's all sorts of gods they give rise to, and we don't know a lot about them, but I'm going to make some hypotheses about the gods, because you might think, well, what the hell are gods anyways, you know? And so I think about them as personalities. They're personalities, and they're archetypal personalities. And so it's like, well, Venus, for example, is the god of love. And I'll show you some pictures of Venus. And so what does that mean exactly? Well, it's like a complex of things. Venus is how you act when you're in love. Venus is what people find sexually attractive in women. Venus is the possession that occurs when you're in love or when you're really attracted to someone. It's all those things, and so it's like a force that can invade you. It's a way of perceiving. It's a superordinate instinct. It's shared across not only human beings, but birds and bees, as we all know. So it's a transcendent property, and it can take personified form because it can inhabit you. And so it's this thing that's sort of objective and sort of subjective, and it's also one of the fundamental elements of the world. So you might say, well, there's Venus, for example, and there's Ares, that's Mars, so that's a god of war, and he's usually masculine, and he's very aggressive, and so he's like the personality of warrior-like rage. So I kind of think about the gods, especially the more fundamental gods, as something like primordial forces. And here's a leap, and I don't know about it, but I think that it's a recapitulation in some sense of individual socialization. So I think that what happens to begin with is that, you know, as you emerge as an individual, you start out in a chaotic and unformed manner, and then these things come to life inside of you. And those things are these fundamental motivational systems that we were talking about. And so they're the first products of chaos. And then those things have to get their act together. Okay, so like I said, that's a leap, and I haven't been able to completely fill in the gaps there. But in any case, all these gods and goddesses get created by Tiamat and Apsu, right? So then they're running around causing trouble, the first gods. They make a lot of racket, they're doing a lot of impulsive and crazy things, and they make a lot of noise, and they're not very cautious, and they make a big mistake. They kill Apsu, and then they live on his body. Now that's a weird one, eh? And you think, well, okay, what's going on there? Well, Apsu is masculine, and so the masculine thing seems to be associated in some way with like God the Father and the dominance hierarchy. And so what does it mean if he's dead? It means that all this chaotic activity that's disintegrated has killed the structure, and so they're all now living on a corpse, which is not a good thing. And maybe they didn't know what they killed, and so imagine they're careless, they're kind of clueless, they don't know what the hell's going on, they break a bunch of rules, and they destroy the orderly element of what initially gave rise to them. And then they live on its corpse. Another way of thinking about that is that that's what you guys do. You're living on a corpse. You're living on the corpse of the past, right? And it's the consequence of the activity of the dead. And it's dead because it's the activity of the dead, right? I mean, the library, there's no life in a library except for the people in it. The rest of it's all ghosts. So you're living on the dead shell of the past. Okay, anyways.